Welcome to episode 53 of Real Health Radio. You can find the links talked about as part of this episode at the show notes. It's www.7, all spelt out, so seven-health.com/53.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Hi guys, and welcome to another episode of Real Health Radio. This week is another one where I'm interviewing a guest, but instead of having just one guest, I have two. And for this show, I'm speaking to Brad Abrahams and Jeremy Stuart, and they are the directors of a new documentary called On the Back of a Tiger. And the tagline for the documentary is the workings of life revised. Maverick scientists and thinkers challenge our understanding of disease, aging, nutrition, and consciousness. And the documentary is still a work in progress, but it is nearing completion, which is why I wanted to have the guys on. And I remember first hearing about this back in probably early 2015. And it caught my attention because it was going to be interviewing lots of people that I respect, whose work I read, but that most people have never heard of. And one of these people is Ray Peat, and I've been fascinated by his work for the last 6 or 7 years, and the thought of getting to see him as part of the documentary, focusing on a lot of his philosophies and alongside others who share contrarian ideas in terms of science and a lot of ideas in terms of the world at large, for me was just very exciting. And so what I will say is that the majority of people we talk about in this interview, you probably will never have heard of. But just because you haven't heard their names doesn't make their work any less important. And Brad and Jeremy are able to explain what some of the subjects of the film have been able to show as part of their research and why this flies in the face of what we're commonly told about, say, how cells work or why we get certain diseases. And I will just add, the most common comment I get from people who reach out to me after listening to my podcasts or reading my articles is just how sane and sensible I am. So there are probably ideas and concepts that we chat about in this show that may make you think that I've gone off the deep end. I really haven't. I read widely on so much of this stuff. I've just never known exactly how to distill it and bring it to an audience in a really easy to understand way. So please be patient with this podcast. There will undoubtedly be concepts you haven't heard of or some of the science that we talk about that you may not understand, but please stick with it because the message of the documentary is a really important one. And once it is released, I'll be letting you all know where you can go and check it out. In the meantime, you can watch the trailer for it. If you just Google On the Back of a Tiger trailer, and it will be the first link that comes up. It's on Vimeo. I'm also going to put a link to it in the show notes. So without further ado, here is my interview with Brad Abrahams and Jeremy Stuart. So, hey, Brad and Jeremy, welcome to Real Health Radio.
Thank you. Thanks
nice
for having us.
Nice to be here.
And look, the reason I've invited you on the show is to talk about the documentary that you guys are putting together called On the Back of a Tiger, which I'm incredibly thrilled about, although I'm still aware it's a work in progress. But I guess, to start with, how did you guys both become interested in health? Did either of you have your own health challenges, or are there other reasons you were drawn towards health and nutrition?
Yeah, I think we've both gone through our own health journeys, and that definitely was going on long before the film came about. Specifically, I feel like it was the interest in nutrition that led to this film, even though the film is not focused on nutrition.
Okay.
But I've always had an interest in science since I was a kid, and nutrition came later with, dealing with various health issues.
Yeah, neither of us have had any serious health issues or complications, just what I think most people experience, which is, problems with digestion or allergies or sleeping issues. that is what ultimately brought both of us together, because when Jeremy, we used to work for the same company, but Jeremy was in the Chicago office and I was in the Seattle office, and he came out for a job and I saw him on the World's Healthiest Foods website, which was one of those early health nut websites, and immediately knew that he was a kindred spirit. And from then on, we could talk about all of our weird health experimentations and dietary experimentations.
Okay. And was that something that went on for quite a while? Like, were you trying different diets and different things?
Yes, almost lifelong. And it eventually led us both to the work of Ray Peat, because it actually seemed, even from the outset, it seems extremely unconventional, even to unconventional people. The more you actually read into it and do your own research, the more it actually makes sense and seems to be one of the most sane ways of looking at nutrition and eating.
Okay. And look, I mean, definitely Ray Peat is like one of the kind of central characters as part of the documentary, or at least he was like the linchpin that connected a lot of the first round of interviewees. I mean, Ray Peat is someone whose work I've been like fascinated with for the last sort of 6, maybe 7 years, somewhere around there. There's probably a lot of people who are listening to this podcast who don't know who Ray Peat is. So are you able to describe like who he is, a bit about his work or his philosophies?
Yeah, it's sort of a difficult thing to explain.
I know, I'm asking you to do a very difficult thing.
Explaining him to people who are totally unfamiliar is challenging. And, you know, a number of people that we've interviewed, we've asked them to, like, people who know of him, to explain him. And people almost never can. But I think there's sort of two factors to him. He's known mainly for writing a newsletter about nutrition, I would say. That's what he now has, like a large and continually growing group of internet followers.
Yeah.
But at the heart of it, he's sort of a science critic and someone who originally tried to participate in the world of academics and science, but basically being an anti-authoritarian, I think, at heart. He's always seen through a lot of the established dogmas. So even though he writes largely an obscure newsletter, mainly about nutrition topics, he really ends up commenting on a lot of huge concepts in politics and society, culture, and health in general.
He's really one of the few people that are adept at connecting the dots of things that seem very disparate and unrelated, connecting them together and then forming a much larger overarching theory from that.
And so how did you guys first come across his work? And also, what did you think of it when you first discovered it? And part of the reason I'm asking this is I remember when I first discovered Ray's work, like, so much of it, like, A, was completely against everything I'd like read before and also being taught. But I also found his writing quite difficult to follow because he was referencing like so many things that I'd never heard of before. And what I find quite funny now is like I read his writing and I find him a very elegant writer, and I think he has a really like beautiful way with words. But that definitely wasn't how I originally felt when I read his stuff. So yeah, just like what was your experience when you first discovered him?
For myself, I actually thought it sounded crazy at first. And I was coming from already having experimented with many different things. And it was just that, you know, someone saying, even though it's not as simplistic as it sounds, but someone saying eating lots of sugar is good, for example, or all vegetable oils and fish oils are bad, oversimplifying. But again, that's one of the messages. It was almost too much to take at the time, and coupled with his somewhat difficult and high-level writing style. So I just put him aside, and it took actually a year or two for me to come back around and start thinking, well, maybe this guy was onto something. Putting in the work, which I think it really needs, and then realizing that he is actually really a genius and one of the few.
I think one of the major problems with getting into his work in the first place is he has seemingly no interest in commerce. So
yeah.
He doesn't make it easy for anyone to like get the gist of where he's coming from. His newsletter is sort of like a continuous journey of exploring new topics, building on things he's talked about in the past. It's not like he has a finished, complete body of work that is anywhere to be presented to you.
Yeah.
So if you just jump in and look at an article on his like website that looks like it's from the 90s, it seems, there's no context. So what struck me was exactly that his conclusions were so the opposite of everything that you hear in the mainstream. But then it's, backed up with a whole bunch of references to scientific studies, which is so rare to see in any writing about health or nutrition. So I found it really interesting, and the stories he was telling about the context of the time, things in science, what was going on in the 30s, all the things that influence the conclusion that he draws was just like a compelling narrative. And so it got me interested in reading more, and there was so much to read. It took a long time before I, felt comfortable with saying I could understand what he was talking about.
Yeah. And I think what you find, like, the more I read his articles, the more you find that a lot of articles are saying a lot of the same things, but in a very different way. And there's like really common threads that run through pretty much every one of the pieces he puts out. And he's got, for anyone who hasn't read any of his stuff, go to his website and you'll spend like literally days and days just reading through articles that he's got up there that are all for free. And as you said, are all very well referenced and very well researched.
And the thing that, on top of that, I found over time more convincing about his perspective is that he doesn't have anything to sell.
Yeah.
As he became more popular, I think he took down his. He used to sell his books on his website, but he was getting too many orders, so he removed that.
That should really be a litmus test for people in terms of the trustworthiness or just how genuine someone that they're reading or I don't like the word, but following really is. Because if there is even a little bit of a monetary anything to be gained financially, then you can't completely trust the motives.
And I think, even to get his newsletter, if I'm remembering correctly, like you've got to send a check, and it's like even that's very like he makes it as difficult as humanly possible to give him any money for any work that he does.
Yeah, pretty much.
And sometimes he doesn't even cash the check that you send him.
And so, how was it for you guys when you actually met Ray and like did that interview with him and got to spend time with him? Because I know there's that like adage of like people shouldn't meet their heroes for fear of being like really let down. But from what I saw on like your blog and then like little interview excerpts that you share, like I get the feeling that you had the total opposite experience to that.
Yeah, it was kind of amazing meeting someone who really seems to have almost no ego or very little ego or self-importance, and is just all about, the research and communicating certain ideas or perspectives. So you might notice in his interviews, whenever someone thanks him, he doesn't say like, "Oh, you're welcome," or "Oh, thank you." He just sort of says, "Mm-hmm." He just does not seem to register any kind of adulation or putting him up on any kind of pedestal. And that actually made for a very relaxed and comfortable meeting and exchange with him, because we were sort of immediately on his level. We didn't, feel like peons next to this great man.
Yeah.
So it was actually like a very comfortable and easily flowing conversation and meeting, and actually met with him over the course of 3 days. And he just, talked and talked and talked. And he said, only Fidel Castro could
and
talk.
Buckminster Fuller.
Yeah, and Buckminster Fuller could talk for as long uninterrupted as him.
The only people with as much speaking stamina.
Wow. And am I right in thinking that initially with the documentary it was going to be much more focused on him, and then it got like branched out into be like a much more like broader take in terms of like health and that sort of thing?
Definitely the initial sort of concept of doing a documentary was inspired by Ray being sort of a mysterious, not self-described health guru, and the somewhat or sometimes extremely unusual internet following and rituals going on around that. So it was, a very specific niche sort of inspiration. But it very quickly grew into, if you try and address any of the things that he's talking about, there are some of the biggest questions there are about how life works in the world and culture. And we posed it to him when we first contacted him that we were, interested in making a film about science, basically, and the problems in science and the things that he talks about. So he immediately, was like, oh, you should look up this person and this person. And he sort of gave us a bunch of direction. And it grew quickly from there.
And he probably, from his perspective, thought that, a film just about him wouldn't be as useful as a film that was about the bigger picture and talking about some of these scientists who, like him, are almost invisible to the mainstream. Yeah.
And as I think from what you said earlier on in terms of him having like no ego, he must have been probably quite surprised that someone was wanting to make a whole documentary about him as well.
Yeah, and that was one of the things he commented on when we met him, just that, because we were mentioning, his newsletters and things that he had said, quotes, and he was just sort of shocked that anyone would know so much about him.
Yeah.
And we had also mentioned that he was completely unaware of his internet presence or following. All his only interface with people had been over email, and he had never seen any of the Facebook groups or forums or websites or anything like that. So that was eye-opening for him, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, he's a 76-year-old guy at the time living in Oregon who mainly just wrote a newsletter that he sent by hand, and then like someone else, webmaster, would like occasionally put up an article on his website, which he didn't run. So for him, it was, I think, surprising when almost suddenly he started getting lots of emails from people he'd never met or heard of asking him for health advice.
And how does he even know how that even started? Like, is there someone that you can trace back to that was the person who started first talking about Ray?
It was most likely Danny Roddy.
Okay.
I think there were a few people who, found his website on their own based on just searching for specific things about hormones or things like that. But yeah, I think Danny Roddy was probably the first person to drive actual traffic to his website.
Because I think prior to me finding or me discovering Danny Roddy, I know Josh Rubin from East West Healing used to do interviews with him, and he was probably one of the first people who really started to put me onto his work. But I didn't know if there were people then even earlier than that were starting to really talk about him.
Not that I know of. If there was, it was before I knew about him.
Okay, fine. And so how long had you guys thought about wanting to make this documentary before you actually started making the documentary? Was it a thing that you kind of discussed for a couple of years, or was it something that you decided and then just hit the ground running pretty quickly?
It didn't take too long before we were, starting to actually try and plan a shoot. I'm trying to think. I don't really remember when we first talked about that, but I think it was.
I think what gave us the confidence was we, once we sort of formulated a very basic idea, we just emailed Ray, a long shot, and it was like, "Are you interested in at least talking about the idea of a documentary?" And his reply was, "Yeah, just call me like tomorrow." And so it was that, like, just how accessible he made himself, and then how open he was when we first chatted with him, that we then thought, and then how he started mentioning all these other names, gave us a lot of confidence that this was something we could do, and also that it was even, worth pursuing even more than we had originally thought, because it was such a larger story. So I think it was just a couple months from, or maybe 3 or 4 months from, hey, let's make a film, to actually starting
flying to London,
a shoot. Yes.
And how are you making that work in terms of, like, I take it this isn't your full-time job. You have full-time jobs. Like, how are you, like, getting that balance, if there is a way of even getting a balance?
Well, we were both, in, like, basically the commercial filmmaking world.
Okay.
Post-production, production. And at the time, we were both, sort of free agents working. We don't have, like, a job in this field where you have to go to the office every day, usually.
Okay.
But it was all out of pocket. So we decided to do the project because it seemed really interesting, and it came around in a time for me where I was wanting to do something more meaningful. Working on commercials was feeling like a real grind, and not like it was adding anything positive to the world.
Yeah.
But, the craft of filmmaking is something that still was passionate about. So I think for both of us, it was just about balancing, trying to make a passion project at the side, and then, having to go take a freelance job, and then turning around and using all of that money to go do our next shoot.
So we basically take on a paying job whenever we get too far in debt.
Okay.
We just let all our money get eaten up by the film and living expenses, and then we have to take a little hiatus from the process to be able to keep it going. But we did do a Kickstarter that was very successful in our minds, that has made this actually, like, possible for us to really finish the film, which we were worried about before, just burning through our savings.
Yeah.
So we'll probably have to do some more fundraising, probably private fundraising.
Okay.
To finish the post-production, but we're pretty confident that we're going to be able to actually finish this film.
Yeah, where we were working before the Kickstarter, it was becoming clear it would be extremely difficult to finish making the film.
Okay.
Financially.
And were you, like, surprised by the response in terms of the Kickstarter campaign, and the feedback that you got from that, and obviously the money that you got from that?
Yeah, very. It was a extremely pleasant surprise. We had sort of reached out to the community, and just been sort of active on Facebook groups and the forum. So we knew that people would be interested in this project in that community, but we had no idea what sort of financial support that would turn into.
Yeah.
We expected not very much. It's not a huge community, maybe a few thousand people who are sort of like hardcore internet savvy Ray Peat fans.
Yeah.
Who we saw as, like, our core audience to begin with. And at least, like, some of the only people in the world who might know all of the people that we were interested in talking to. So when we, we started sharing what we've been shooting just on our own, out of our own pocket, and that got some attention. So we were ready to launch the Kickstarter campaign, and we knew there'd be people interested, but we had no idea what kind of money we could ask for. And so we basically went as low as we possibly could to think, like, maybe we could shoot the rest of it with this.
Yeah.
And we were still unsure that even that we'd even reach that small amount. We thought that we would have to, somehow break through to the mainstream, get some mainstream coverage to be able to make our goal and surpass it. And we ended up doubling our goal without getting any mainstream coverage, which is pretty amazing. But also
over 200%.
Wow.
Yeah, it also highlights, though, our challenge of breaking through to the mainstream.
Okay.
Like appealing to a mainstream audience, or at least getting it in the consciousness, like public consciousness, that's one of our sort of pressing concerns. And it's also how, we've taken that into account in how we now shape the narrative of the film and what we've chosen to focus on, because it's, not really much use to only appeal to a small group that already agrees with everything that's in it. Those are our core fans and who helped us fund the film, but it's not ultimately who the film is for.
And did you, because of the money you got for Kickstarter or because of the reaction, has that allowed you to now start interviewing extra people, or to be doing, I don't know, extra stuff in terms of visualizations or like animation or whatever it may be that you're like, I can now do this, but we couldn't do it before?
At the most basic level, the thing that it allowed us was to just keep working on the film.
Okay.
And to actually take a chunk of time to go do like several shoots in a row, something we just couldn't afford to do before because it was too expensive to travel and rent gear and just live. So it was, amazing to be able to just like look at the calendar and have the money to plan shoots and plan to work on the film without going into debt doing it. But it definitely also afforded us to think bigger about, what we would be able to do and have some more freedom to not have to be so worried about the financials of it. But we both come from a background of sort of doing all of the expensive parts of post-production. Okay. So we have like an edge there, and that we can provide that to ourselves for free. So I think compared to some documentaries, we were able to, we've done basically everything as just a two-man crew, which is sort of insane. But so we got enough to basically shoot everything we want to shoot, which was amazing.
And you said before, in terms of like, you don't want to be preaching to the choir, you want this to have more broader appeal. So like, what are some of the, and again, this might be a difficult question to answer, but some of the themes of the film, and there's obviously going to be lots of different ideas from different interviewees, but like, what are the like philosophies, or what are you wanting like the audience to really take away from the film?
Right.
You can go ahead, Jeremy. If you like.
I guess we haven't said what the film is about yet.
Okay.
So yeah, it's essentially about a group of scientists and thinkers whose work calls into question some of the basic assumptions about how life actually works. And that's sort of like the nugget of the premise.
And more specifically, asking, what if our health or our lives aren't as genetically predetermined as we think? Because that is the prevailing dogma.
Okay.
Currently, in both, it's basically how science and medicine and industry operate is on this model, this gene-based, mechanistic, fatally predetermined model. Even though, every day there's studies for decades showing that that's not the case. It is still very much in the minds of scientists and what guides them, as well as funding agencies, and then the general public. That is what's at the forefront of their minds. You hear every day people saying, "It's in my DNA," or I just have the genes for this, so there's nothing I can do about it. So one of the missions of the film is dismantling that idea, showing the science behind why it's a false model, showing what a different model could be. Maybe not the answer, but something that much better explains life phenomena, and diseases, and then, how we can then apply these ideas to our own health and how scientists are currently doing that. So we take it from the cellular level, even smaller, down to water molecules, and then all the way up to how that relates to consciousness. And along the way, sort of laying bare the flaws in the establishment, both scientific and medical, that have led to perpetuating the current model that is obviously so flawed. So we get into issues with scientific research, the educational system, peer review, reductionism, authoritarianism, how big pharma and politics influence policy, and then also the doctor-patient relationship, and offer an establishment or a guide to what a more productive and more human approach could look like. So it's a very large mission that we have.
Right. Yeah, that sounds like quite a lot to cover in one, what I would imagine is a 90-minute documentary.
Yes.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll go 100 minutes then.
Okay. Yeah, that'll cover it.
There's all these stories that we basically learn growing up in Western culture, all these assumptions about the way life works, and genes and sort of our outlook on the world, and a lot of them seem to be backed up by something that, when you look at it, is really just a theory that's been perpetuated for a very long time, but not necessarily ever proven. And I think from the perspective of like the culture at large, not people in science, we grew up with this attitude that things are sort of figured out and we're living in the future, and science is working and, progress is happening. But when you actually look into the workings of science, it's actually, kind of a mess today, possibly more so than it's been for 100 years. And so when you look at people working in the field, these stories don't really pan out. There's scientists with all sorts of different opinions, and there's sort of the establishment people upholding the stories that we hear. But then there's a whole bunch of people doing work that completely flies in the face of these theories. So if you just sort of adjust a couple of those things, it trickles down to having to adjust your whole viewpoint about lots of our assumptions about the world.
And it doesn't take long to realize that some of the most, prescient diseases like cancer or heart disease or depression or obesity, there's still not really much of a consensus on what causes them and what to do about them. And over the last, you could say 50 years, very little progress has been made in preventing or treating them. It's just, tiny successes here and there. I think for Alzheimer's, 99.95% of the studies and the treatments have failed. And they've been working on that for about 40 years or more. So there's obviously, it seems obvious, at least to us, that the problem goes much further back in the chain. And it's a foundation that a lot of these scientific principles are based on that has sort of become decayed away and needs to be rebuilt before we really will make much progress or have any breakthroughs when it comes to these diseases.
And so, with that as in mind, I want to talk about just some of the interviewees that you have covered as part of it. And there's nearly, I think 20 odd people, so we're not going to be able to cover all of them. But just so people get a bit of an understanding of when you say things aren't as people assume, or there's lots of stuff that doesn't quite add up. I just like to go through some of them. So starting with Harold Hillman, do you want to talk a little about him and what his experiments have shown?
Sure, yeah. And he unfortunately just passed away about 10 days ago.
Okay, that's like the second person, because was it Mei Wan Ho also passed away as well?
Yes.
So while that's obviously very upsetting, we do feel fortunate that we were able to interview them and capture them so comprehensively that, I mean, the bigger shame would have been that their word would never have gotten out there.
Yeah.
So at least there's that. At least there's a chance now that in a sort of artful and convincing way, people will actually hear their messages and learn about their work.
And so Harold Hillman, he was sort of an amazing figure all around. One of the founders of Amnesty International. He has like 1 million degrees. He's like a neurologist, a doctor. He was responsible for ending a number of capital punishment death penalties in several American states based on some research he did. And in his biological work, he essentially just called into question a number of techniques in microscopy, which is essentially the evidence for all of our standard models. And he shows through some really simple experiments how easy it is to create artifacts. Like when you're preparing to observe life and look at it in a microscope, like most cells just sort of look like a blob with no detail. And so historically there have been all these recipes to prepare them for viewing, which, includes all sorts of various stains and solvents and things like that. So he showed first, I think, that those were that those processes drastically change the way that the cell looks. And so, 150 years ago, people were doing this. Essentially, in his view, they were creating artifacts. So you're creating something new with your process of preparing the cell, and then you're labeling these pieces that you've created, like baking a ball of dough and then like cutting it up and labeling the bubbles and the crust as like important features. So he said that about like basic light microscopy. He shows that there are other like better techniques. And then he also has a number of criticisms of electron microscopy, which is sort of like the more modern darling of observing the workings of the cell. And all of these processes involve completely stopping life, killing it, and just to prepare it to look at. So that's another argument of his that, how much can you learn about the living state, about life actually, when most of biochemistry is about completely obliterating the tissue, grinding it up and separating the enzymes and all the parts and testing those. And that's somehow supposed to give you an idea about how life really works.
And the way that he's broken down his argument and shown it, he's made some films very specifically showing what each step does to the cell and why certain features of the cell are in fact artifacts rather than parts of the cell. It's almost irrefutable. And for that reason, he's never really been taken on. He had challenged some, heads of microscopical societies to debates, which a couple have happened, but it became clear to them that they weren't going to win. So instead, he just was completely ignored. That was the tactic. Or he says there's multiple times where they would just leave the room when he would walk in, and sometimes even run away from him because there was no way out of his arguments. You can just show them so simply. And they're all very logical, easy to understand, easy to follow criticisms. And so if, all these structures of the cell that we're studying and are apparently so important, like, the bilayer membrane and the pumps and channels aren't actually there, then so there's the trickle down effect is so massive, it would really cause a rewriting of a lot of what we know about biology.
So even if he's only a little bit right, it still means re-examining a lot of things.
And in terms of then the next person was like Gilbert Ling, and he's definitely someone I remember like Ray Peat talking about a lot in his articles. And from some of the stuff you just said there in terms of Hillman, I think probably also applies to Ling in terms of his thoughts around how the cell really works and like how that's different to the more conventional view that most people are told.
Like if, just briefly, so Hillman has shown that there aren't any channels or pores on the membrane of the cell. They've never been viewed. No one's ever seen them, but apparently there's hundreds of them. If those don't exist, and so if the substances like sodium and potassium aren't shuttled in and out of the cell via pumps and channels, then how are they? And other substances as well, how does that work? And then it's Gilbert Ling's association induction hypothesis that shows how that could work and works much better than the pump and channel model.
So the core initial group that we selected of interview subjects, they all sort of fit into sort of being part of this same world, being aware of Gilbert Ling. So Mei-Wan Ho, Harold Hillman, Gilbert Ling, and Gerald Pollack sort of are aware of each other's work to some degree. And so Ling is the one who he spent like decades basically working on his theory, refuting the basic theory and model of the cell and presenting one that in many ways works more simply and more easily explains all the things that happen, instead of having to invent a new pump every time you find a new compound that interacts with the cell. And then Mei-Wan Ho and Gerald Pollack both talk about the nature of water, which is another sort of important factor. One of the things that there's a lot of, there is an assumption of we think we know how water works, and it's sort of, not examined anymore. But Gerald Pollack has spent a bunch of time sort of examining the unusual properties and showing essentially the difference between what's normally called bulk water, basically just the regular water like come out of the tap, and the state that water is in when it's inside an actively living cell, which seems to be a much different thing. So the old traditional model is sort of that there's the lipid bilayer, like the lipid membrane. It's basically somehow a bag of water made of fat. But this other model is essentially the state of proteins and water together.
Yeah.
It's sort of the simplest difference.
And I actually, for anyone who's interested in this, I did a podcast last week on the importance of like different light spectrums with health, and I actually referenced like Gerald Pollack's ideas, and I linked to a TED talk that he did on like the fourth state of water and how sunlight can affect all this. So if you're interested, I'm going to put that in the show notes for people to check out.
Sure, yeah.
One of the things about all these ideas that's appealing, and going back to Ray Peat, is sort of talking about the generalities of how things work. And it seems like in the traditional model, there's like all these new things and they have to be sort of piecemealed together. It's very complex and there's kind of like no big picture. Whereas looking at the way Ray talks about things and understanding how water and metabolism change based on the influence of certain spectrums of light and things like that, this other model starts to intuitively kind of make more sense and seem simpler than than the old model that people have been building on top of for 150 years.
And the next person that I just want to mention was Fred Kummerow, and a lot of his focus is in terms of like dietary fat. Do you want to like talk a little about him and what he's discovered or what he talks about?
Sure. So Fred's the reason now why trans fats are largely banned in some places or the amount controlled, and only because of 60 years of him petitioning the FDA before eventually someone threatening to sue them because what they were doing was illegal by ignoring him. And so when they finally did take a look, action was taken. So he was one of the originators of research on heart disease.
Okay.
Or unconventional research on heart disease and alternate pathways for it, as opposed to the cholesterol/saturated fat connection, talking more about the genesis of heart disease being trans fats and polyunsaturated fats, two things that no one was talking about at the time. And trans fats, that they got all of the sort of media attention.
Yeah.
But he basically had the same, not exactly the same, but very similar damning prognosis for polyunsaturated fats, in that they oxidize in your bloodstream and by that fact cause, almost can be implicated in almost any disease, particularly heart disease and diabetes by their anti-metabolic effect. But no one has picked up on his research or anything that he said about polyunsaturated fats.
It was mentioned in one
in passing.
I think New York Times article, I think. It was sort of in the same sentence with trans fats.
Right.
But the ban was only on trans fats. So,
and he hasn't really kept in touch or current with the health fads of the day. And he was absolutely horrified to learn that people take omega-3s or fish oil and flax oil as a supplement for health, because in his mind, you're killing yourself by doing that. And some people have died that have consumed massive amounts of some of the vegetable oils or fish oils.
And Fred is 100 years old.
Yeah. Yes. Soon 101 in a couple months.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And he's never overtly consumed any vegetable oil in his life or fried anything. Eats very simply. One of the few scientists that actually practice what they discover.
Yeah.
And it really shows with him, with really kind of flawless hair and skin for someone who's nearly 101 years old. His skin looks better than some people in their 40s.
Yeah, he's in amazing condition.
And I think this is probably the idea that most people who know Ray Peat or first get into Ray Peat's work become exposed to, in terms of him talking about the dangers of PUFAs or polyunsaturated fats and how much that goes against the mainstream. I think a lot of people are getting on board with, okay, vegetable oils aren't so great, but in terms of the fish oils, that's something that is still very much people aren't agreeing with and are saying that's not correct.
Right, exactly. And part of that whole story, the marketing behind these oils, is that they're integral for your cell membranes and that they're essential. So all that marketing is tangentially attached to this biological model of the cell. That seems to not be really right. And there's lots of simple examples to refute the idea, like just culturing cells in a petri dish in the absence of any fat. They can be perfectly healthy and replicate. So, how essential are these fats? So when you pull apart a couple of these things, the reasoning for consuming any of these oils is really called into question.
And then, look, I think in reality, there's no way you can avoid getting them because they are in fruits and vegetables and lots of different foods. But I think there's a difference between that and people actively taking like mega doses of fish oils.
Exactly.
Yeah. Even Kummerow himself, who he actually still believes that in some amount they are required, just because he, being still a traditional scientist, believes in the lipid bilayer. But even he said it's the amount that you get just from fruits or vegetables, or that's already in, some animal products, that's enough.
Yeah.
And
it covers your essential.
You'd never need to supplement that.
And am I correct in thinking that like Chris Masterjohn used to like mentor with him or worked with him at some point?
And live in his basement.
Okay.
We found mail that was addressed to Chris at Kummerow's house.
Okay.
Yeah, right when we walked in, there was like a stack of mail that was like, for Chris Masterjohn. And we were like, oh, why do you have mail for Chris Masterjohn? And he was like, oh, he just moved out of my basement.
And look, for people listening, Chris Masterjohn's recently set up a podcast that I've really been enjoying. So again, I'll put a link to that in the show notes. He's someone who can really talk about the kind of in-depth science in a pretty easy to understand way, or easy-ish way to understand it. And so there's just two more guys that I wanted to mention or go through. Both of these were people I wasn't aware of, names I hadn't heard of until I saw that you had interviewed them and you'd sent them over as part of like the email exchange we had. So the first is George Slavich. And like, do you want to just talk about like what's the research he's done, or what information is he putting out, and why you wanted to include him in the film?
There's the idea of genetic determinism.
Okay.
Sort of became popular in the 80s, and the whole idea you're determined by your genes. So that's one thing that largely across the board has been in many ways called into question by epigenetics and things like that. But so George Slavich, his work specifically shows how within minutes you can see changes in your genome from the effects of stress. And he's a stress researcher. He's the head of the UCLA stress lab. And so he does a lot of work he mainly focuses on social stress, which is sort of interesting because it's like, no actual physical interaction.
Yeah.
But how quickly you can see all sorts of biological responses from your perception of situations around you, perceived threat. Like just what was the study, Brad, that he did with like teenage girls?
Yeah, it was a social rejection study where basically he made teenage girls feel like they were being judged harshly by their peers. And that actually turns out to be one of the most potent stressors of stress registering in the brain and then in your DNA as something that's as damaging as like a physical injury would be. Gives the same stress response and inflammation response in your body.
And I think I've seen some really interesting research as well looking at like poverty or people who are like really struggling, and where they like basically gave them better quality food and it actually made a little bit of a difference but not a huge amount of difference. And when they were looking into it, it's like the lack of autonomy and the lack of control that those people have has like probably the biggest damning effect on them more than anything else. Yeah,
and there was Slavich mentioned a study that was done, I think it was in Turkey, where it was the same ethnic group, but they took, half of the ones in the study lived in the city and the other half lived in the country. And so genetically they were very similar, but in terms of prevalence of, certain diseases that were thought to be genetically determined, like cancer and others, there was huge difference between the two. And it was because gene expression had changed depending on their environment.
And I think a lot of this is sort of intuitively obvious to people, but a lot of the ideas in science have essentially said otherwise.
And then the final person is like Paul Andrews. Like, who is he and what's his message?
He's a depression researcher.
Okay.
He comes at it from an evolutionary perspective. But we were just sort of tipped off onto a study that he published about serotonin and depression, and how his work, illuminates how the whole idea about serotonin being how the lack of serotonin is supposedly the cause of depression has been like sold to us over and over through pharmaceuticals and all sorts of things.
Yeah.
And his research really shows the opposite. And so he got a bit of press on that, calling into question the workings of antidepressants.
In that, the higher circulating serotonin was actually correlated more with depression, and lower circulating was correlated with not being depressed. I think the name of the study was the science of antidepressants was backwards. And now I don't know if it's been published yet, but he's been working on a gigantic worldwide meta-study that correlates SSRIs with increase in all-cause mortality. Basically, that if you're on them, you have a 30% greater chance of dying from any disease, because serotonin is so intrinsic to almost every system in your body, from digestion to mood to heart health, everything, clotting.
Blood. Yeah.
So when you monkey with that system, there are consequences, and it's not fully understood just how those drugs actually work and how they're modifying the system. So they're now fairly clearly doing a lot of harm, and statistically they help so few people that it really is not worth being on them. It's better to go through the depression. And
it's quite fascinating what you say about that. It reminds me of, there was an interview that I heard with Ray with Josh Rubin from East West Healing, and he was talking a lot about the theory around serotonin being like the happy hormone starting at the same time around the ban on LSD, and how like LSD was talked about as this anti-serotonin, and that was why it was supposedly so bad for people. And this is quite interesting now because like LSD is slowly making a comeback, being used in the medical community. Like Michael Pollan wrote a really long piece in the New Yorker about it. I know like Tim Ferriss and Tony Robbins are like behind projects that are testing psilocybin, which is like the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, with John Hopkins, like for treating depression. So I wonder if like any of this effect and this stuff coming out will change people's perspective about like serotonin and depression and how those things are linked.
Yeah. You would think that it would. It seems like lately these stories come out which seem to completely at least put a big hole in the standard story, but it usually ends up being that it's sort of like tacked on. Like some of the antidepressants that don't raise serotonin but work, they call it like a novel antidepressant. They're like, we don't know why. It does the exact opposite, but it's really good at stopping depression. You kind of like put a different label on it, shrug your shoulders and move on, but you don't. I think it's so difficult, as a scientist, to be like, look, this happens, therefore this whole other story needs to be questioned. Yeah. I think we basically can't do that, unfortunately. So it's very slow for things to change. But there's all this stuff coming out now that seems to be going in the right direction.
Perfect. Well, look, you probably ask this all the time, and it's probably not the question you enjoy getting, but like, when is it likely that the film is going to be ready?
Before the end of the year.
Okay.
Yeah. That's being realistic. We'd like to be more optimistic, but
we would love to have a release date to tell people.
Yeah.
Very much love that. But yeah.
It's just it's an extremely large project, and we want to do it justice and at a very high quality. So we're not cutting corners and taking our time. And there's, we have 200 hours of material to edit and craft a sort of succinct and impactful story out of, and still need to shoot more. So just for people to realize how massive and unwieldy a project it is.
That being said, we've made a huge amount of progress in the past couple of months.
Yes. We are sort of deep in the editing phase.
Okay.
Yeah, we're actively chipping away every day. So we are working on it.
And I guess there will be, like you said, like Harold Hillman's passed away, Mei Wan Ho also recently passed away. You've probably got a lot of footage that, even if it's only a small amount of people, would be loving to see in its like full entirety. Do you have plans of doing anything with that, but with the footage in its kind of longer form?
We don't have a plan for that right now. What we have been doing is people who have donated or who were backers on the Kickstarter campaign, as a special reward for them, we released a number of the key interviews in their entirety as audio podcasts.
Okay.
So we've had a bunch of people who have been like super into that, which has been amazing. So those have been available for some people. Down the line, we'll definitely make those available to a wider audience. And I don't know, after this film is done, maybe we'll try and do some, I think we've said before, we could probably do a piece just on Harold. So we'll see. First step is finish this film.
Obviously you've got a lot on at the moment that you need to get finished off first. And so how do you envisage it being released? Where will people be able to access it? Like, are you doing the different film festivals? Like, what's the plan, even if nothing's set in stone at this stage?
Film festivals. Yeah. Film festivals are first, just because there's certain restrictions on where your film can be shown before it's shown at the festival. So if it gets into any high-profile film festivals, that's going to be the first place, and then immediately after that, depending on certain distribution agreements that may happen, it'll mainly be available through streaming.
Okay.
That's really how documentaries are widely disseminated these days, and how, if there's any profit to be made as well, it comes through streaming. And we'll have we'll probably set up some screenings in some of the major cities, because we have quite a few fans in each place.
Okay.
But we're not imagining any kind of like wide theatrical releasing of this.
Sure. So, like, I guess best would be that if it made it on something like Netflix, where it is going to be most likely to hit a really big audience.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Perfect. Well, look, thank you so much for coming on and for chatting to me about the film. I'm like really excited about it. For people who want to find out more and to follow you and just get updates in terms of the journey, like, where should they be going?
You can go to our blog, which is perceivethinkact.com. That's our production journal, and we update on progress, and you can read about some of our shoots. But then there's also our Facebook, and if you just look up the name of the film, which is On the Back of a Tiger, you'll find our Facebook page.
Perfect.
We do have a Twitter as well, but
you can also email us at perceivethinkact@gmail.com.
Okay. Well, look, I will, as soon as this comes out, I'll be letting all and sundry know to go and check out the film, because, as I said, I'm really looking forward to seeing it. And thank you so much for dedicating your time to do this, because it's really interesting. Very just to get these kinds of people interviewed that don't really get the respect or the airtime, I think is a really important thing.
Well, thank you so much for having us, and thank you for your interest in our project.
Thanks for listening to Real Health Radio. If you are interested in more details, you can find them at the 7 Health website. That's www.7health.com.